CBS NFL analyst Ryan Wilson and CBS NFL writer Tyler Sullivan aboard to react. Guys, some tough news and crushing news, as Kyle Shanahan puts it here, about their starting quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo, who was not the starting quarterback to start the season as the franchise turned to Trey Lance. Now they turn to Brock Purdy. So much to unpack here, but just surface level. Tyler Sullivan, your reaction to the news is what?
Yeah, no, it's brutal for this 49ers team, but it's also brutal for Jimmy Garoppolo. I mean, this is a guy that has really suffered a tremendous amount of injuries throughout his career and has still been able to play at a high level. And obviously the situations coming into the year as the backup quarterback to Trey Lance, stays with the 49ers despite possibly fielding offers to go someplace else, stays with the team, gets an opportunity, and it felt like there was a possibility to go on a Nick Foles special type of run here with the way the defense has been playing, and ultimately it comes down to an unfortunate end for him and unfortunate for the San Francisco 49ers overall. So you feel for Jimmy Garoppolo most of all.
No, that's a great point, Sully. You mentioned Nick Foles, and that's an interesting comparison because while Brock Purdy hasn't played a long time in the NFL, he is now the next man up. And as someone who also covers the draft, I went and looked up my notes on Brock Purdy. Had him as a late day 3 guy. He was Mr. Irrelevant, as we know. But the notes on him in 2019, that season, were much better than they were in 2020. And he's great in terms of throwing the ball into tight windows. That can be good or bad. He throws with anticipation. We saw that at points today. He's incredibly mobile. And I wrote at the time, he gave me Baker Mayfield vibes, and that was a good thing in the moment. Last year, he was a little bit more inconsistent. He'd missed some easy throws. He didn't feel the pressure in the pocket. And I made the comp more Colt McCoy. You can win with both those guys, by the way, when they're playing at their peak. And I think we sort of heard Kyle Shanahan allude to it when he said there was a fun game once you got away from the fact that Jimmy Garoppolo's season's over in terms of the way that that team played in its entirety. And I think the takeaway is that they think they can win with Brock Purdy, and I think they're going to be pretty confident going forward. Terrible news for Jimmy G, no doubt about it, as Sully outlined. But the season's not going to stop, and they have to figure this out. And I think Brock Purdy, there are worse places to be with your quarterback situation than with Brock Purdy, who played over 45 games at Iowa State. He had 81 touchdowns, 33 interceptions, completed 67% of his passes. So there's something to work with there based on what we saw over the course of his college career and, of course, what we saw on the field against the Dolphins.
45 games at Iowa State, about 45 minutes of NFL sample size, 25 of 37, 2 touchdowns and an interception. Ryan Wilson, when you say they can win with Brock Purdy as their quarterback, they're only looking to win one thing, and that's a Super Bowl. That's what this defense expects to do, and that's what, until today, this offense expected to do behind Jimmy Garoppolo. They'll have to carry that belief or maybe even find a new belief with Purdy as their quarterback, but situate them amongst the NFC. In your eyes, Purdy is the quarterback of this team. How good can they be?
That's going to be the question. I mean, they're not in the same conversation with the Philadelphia Eagles as we sit here, but there's a reason you give up all you did for Christian McCaffrey. Jimmy Garoppolo is not Patrick Mahomes when he is healthy. He's not Josh Allen. He's a system quarterback who runs that system extremely well and was running as well as he had while his time had been there in San Francisco. Unfortunately, he's done. So what does this mean for Brock Purdy? Well, it means if you're Kyle Shanahan, we're going to lean on the running game. We're going to lean on getting Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel, who are virtually the same player, the ball out in space and letting them do their things. We're not going to take risks unless we need to, and we're going to let the defense do what the defense did against that Dolphins offense, which was explosive until they arrived in Northern California. So I don't think the recipe is going to necessarily change. You probably won't ask Purdy to do nearly as much as you might ask Jimmy Garoppolo to do in third and medium situations, for example. But I would imagine everything else might be pretty close to what the play calls would have been otherwise, because otherwise, that involves the running game, that involves play action, that involves getting the Deebo Samuels and Christian McCaffreys and the Brandon Ayuk's and the George Kittles involved early and often, and then letting the defense clean up the mess. So I expect this team to be a top 3 team in the NFC. Maybe now they're behind the Cowboys, but they're going to the playoffs, and I want to see what happens once they get there.
Yeah, I think Ryan makes a good point there, talking about how it's not like it's a team like Kansas City that lost Patrick Mahomes. Jimmy Garoppolo, a solid conductor of the offense, but I don't know if you necessarily would call him the focal point or the lightning rod of the whole thing. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, it isn't that tremendous of a loss. And I say that lightly because obviously this is a guy that took the team to a Super Bowl and an NFC championship last season. He is the best of all of their options, behind Trey Lance, of course, but obviously a tough loss here. I'm with Wilson. I would still put them in the top 4, probably 4th behind Dallas in terms of the NFC, particularly because of that defense. It is just so dominant. You talk about limiting the Miami Dolphins, who were averaging 30 points a game coming into this with Tua Tagovailoa as their quarterback, to 17 in that win, creating multiple turnovers and scoring. And so to me, that is going to be their formula for how to win. But to me, beyond looking where they could potentially be in the NFC and try to contend for a Super Bowl, they got to win the division. They're only a game up over the Seattle Seahawks. We were able to win over the Los Angeles Rams today. So to me, that's the biggest thing. You got a big game against them coming up in a couple of weeks here. For me, it's continue to have your pace in the NFC West, because if all of a sudden you're asking Brock Purdy to win a bunch of road games in the postseason to get you to a Super Bowl, like we're talking about, that is a really tall task for a young guy like him.
Well, that's what it means for the team. As for the player, from that perspective, a lot of things are changing here in real time for Jimmy Garoppolo, because there was a world in which Jimmy takes this team, let's say, to Super Bowl Sunday, and then John Lynch and this brain trust has to make a tough decision about who their quarterback is next season. Perhaps that decision was just made for them here with the injury to Jimmy Garoppolo. Tyler, as you take a look at Jimmy, reports surfaced here on Sunday that Jimmy and the franchise were open to making amends and getting a deal done moving forward here and staying on this roster, whether that was in a starter or backup role. What does the future of Jimmy Garoppolo look like to you, Tyler?
Yeah, I don't think it's in San Francisco, because unfortunately today is all of the fears realized for the San Francisco 49ers and Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. The whole reason why they made that blockbuster move to go up and get Trey Lance was because of Jimmy Garoppolo's health. He was unable to finish season. That's the whole storyline going into that draft, and why they were able to make, or why they wanted to make that big of a move to get a quarterback that they felt not only could raise their ceiling, but be there for a full season, full regular season, obviously for the postseason. Jimmy Garoppolo is continuing, unfortunately, to show you that his body just doesn't agree with a full regular season in the NFL. For whatever reason, he is unable to stay healthy and really can help this team contend. And when you have question marks about a quarterback's availability, the ability, for me, that's the biggest question about his future going forward. Because we're seeing him being unable to finish these seasons, I don't think the San Francisco 49ers would want to kind of latch onto that. But I do think another franchise would be open to possibly seeing if a reset could help him move forward.
I think you're exactly right, Tyler, in terms of the way you phrase that. It is interesting, though, if they were open to bringing back Jimmy Garoppolo, was it just the case that Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch were just being, they were unable to control themselves and moving on from Jimmy Garoppolo when they traded up all that capital to go get Trey Lance, and perhaps they didn't like what they saw in Trey Lance? That's a conversation for another time. But in terms of where Jimmy Garoppolo might end up, I scribbled some names down while Tyler was talking. Obviously, Jimmy G will be a free agent in a couple months. Geno Smith will be a free agent in a couple months. Houston, Indianapolis, the Jets, who just drafted Zach Wilson, of course. The Saints and Carolina are just teams at the top of the list that could be looking for veteran quarterbacks, if not looking to draft one. So there'll be plenty of options for both those players that I mentioned, assuming Geno doesn't return to Seattle. But I don't think you bring Jimmy G back because you don't want Trey Lance looking over his shoulder. If he's your guy, and it appears that he is, given what you gave up to get him, you move forward with him, and perhaps Brock Purdy becomes Jimmy G 2.0 in that he's cheaper and understands the offense and can do those things you need him to do. But I think Jimmy Garoppolo's future will be somewhere as a starter next season. I just don't think, like Tyler mentioned, it will be in San Francisco.
Yeah, can't seem to find 32 guys who can do it at an elite level. There's always going to be a demand for a Jimmy Garoppolo across the league, but his season is over after this broken foot on Sunday. Gentlemen, thank you. All right, here's a look at where Jimmy Garoppolo stacks up wins and losses relative to his contemporaries. 40-17 as a starter. This is obviously minimum 30 starts. So some big names, some big-time performances. Jimmy Garoppolo lost for the season. The